From the BBC World Service, in association with ABC and All India Radio, this is Stumped.
Hello and welcome to Stumped, your intercontinental hit of news, features and debate from the quirky world of cricket. I'm Alison Mitchell in London, where I watched on the television as England went out of the T20 World Cup at the semi-final stage, beaten by New Zealand when Jimmy Neesham and my namesake, Daryl Mitchell, stars of the show with the bat. And New Zealand, of course, now have the chance to get a first global one-day title, which they would add to their World Test Championship crown. Wouldn't that be something?
Jim Maxwell for the ABC in Sydney. Yes, it has a somewhat Australasian flavour to it, doesn't it? The approaching final. And wonderful news for Daryl Mitchell, whose father, of course, was an all-black coach. So it's strong sporting family in New Zealand. And they play above their weight all the time. And I think for most of us in the sporting world, that was a win that was due for New Zealand over England. We'll see what happens next.
Retribution over the old country, finally. But I've just suddenly realized, sorry, this is a quirky little thought. We got stars for every surname. We've got a Maxwell star, we've got a few Sharmas going, and of course Mitchell as well now. So that's fantastic for Stumped. I'm Charu Sharma for All India Radio in Bangalore, deep in the middle of organizing a major tennis tournament for a group called the International Club of Tennis, which I'm a member of as well. However, this is the first one after COVID. But the depression doesn't go away, not because of our loss in cricket and not because of the weather here. It's just been raining for the last 2 or 3 days, and I fear that our event may suffer greatly. But of course, Indian cricket has suffered greatly. We'll see where we go with that.
You need to move indoors for your tennis, Charu, clearly, with all that rain. Good to have you both along as always. Now, we're going to start this week with the racism scandal that has engulfed cricket in the UK over the last few weeks. The specific story goes back more than a year, but it escalated recently, becoming front page as well as back page news and leading national news programmes, and also leading to MPs getting involved. Now, it surrounds Yorkshire County Cricket Club. They're accused of being institutionally racist by one of their former players, Azeem Rafiq, who's a former England under-19 captain. He said he was left close to suicide by some of the experiences he had at the club when he was playing. Now, Rafiq first spoke out about this in September 2020. Yorkshire then launched an independent investigation, although its independence, perceived or otherwise, was questioned by Rafiq as the law firm appointed by the club to run it used to employ the club's chairman. It was nearly a year later before Yorkshire received the report of the investigation, while Rafiq claimed it had failed to speak to key witnesses. Yorkshire first announced that Rafiq had been the victim of, quote, inappropriate behaviour. Later, following pressure from MPs, the club released a summary of the report which said he was the victim of racial harassment and bullying. But the club said there was insufficient evidence to conclude that Yorkshire was institutionally racist. They also said there was no conduct or action taken by any club employees, players or executives that warranted disciplinary action. Now, that created uproar amongst the public, particularly when a report emerged in the media claiming that a racist term about Rafiq's Pakistani heritage was regularly used towards him, but the investigation had concluded that that was friendly and good-natured banter. Now, since then, several senior figures at Yorkshire have resigned, a host of sponsors have walked out, and the ECB has suspended the club from hosting international matches. Now, a new Yorkshire chairman is in place, that's Lord Kamlesh Patel, and in a press conference last Monday, he said that Azeem Rafiq should be praised as a whistleblower, and in really what's been a complete change of tone for the club, he made a full, unreserved apology. A lot of criticism has been levelled at the way Yorkshire have dealt with it all. So what can be learnt? What is best practice when it comes to dealing with complaints of racism or harassment within sports organisations? Now, I want to do a bit of disclosure at this point. I sit on the board of an organisation called Sports Resolutions, who run investigations and provide dispute resolution to the sports industry, amongst other things. But let's speak to an expert who is directly involved in the field. That's John Mehrzad, a practising QC at Littleton Chambers, who specialises in sports law and commercial. John, welcome to Stumped.
Well, first of all, Alison, absolutely delight to join this august panel on this podcast. Yourself, Jim and Charu, it's a real pleasure.
John, then what is best practice when it comes to dealing with complaints of racism or harassment in sports organisations? I mean, what for you would be, say, a non-negotiable in terms of how things should be gone about?
Well, I'm going to focus in on independent reviews because that's the situation we're looking at. And Alison, as you know, I carry out training to various sporting bodies, both at a domestic and international level in terms of best practice. And I believe that there are 2 points that are absolutely non-negotiable. One you've touched on already, which is whoever carries out the independent review, be it an individual or panel, there must be no conflicts at all. And that is not actual conflicts. You don't actually have to be a member of the law firm, but perceived conflicts. And that's very important because we're talking about public integrity, public trust and confidence, and therefore people who feel as though they are able to contribute to these types of reviews, investigations, do not think they're whitewashed. That's point one. That's fairly obvious, but you'd be surprised how often that might be overlooked. And then secondly, if I can go right to the other end of the process, something I'm very firm about is that if I spend many months and speak to dozens, if not more people, and my job is to uncover and give a view independently, it is imperative that my report or my panel's report is published in full. There is no point in going through this process if it is not published in full, because it obviously, as has happened in this case, leads to rumour, conjecture, and an utter lack of confidence in the process. And I should say, just as a matter of practicality, in such scenarios where the press interest is intense, it is inevitable, number one, that the report will be leaked anyway, which has happened. And number two, there will be a concurrent legal process, which means that the report would have to be disclosed as part of that legal process. So it makes no sense, I'm afraid, practically, and sometimes tough conversations have to be had at the outset, that a report is published in full.
John, it's Jim Maxwell, and I was going to ask you about the particular case here, trust and confidence. You talked about, on the one hand, Yorkshire County Cricket Club, and on the other, the governing body, the ECB. So how closely should these two be working together, and what power do both of these organisations have?
Of course, what the regulator and funder would say, in this case the ECB, we are not the employer. It is Yorkshire Cricket Club who is the employer. So the duties are not on us to investigate. But with the greatest of respect, whilst that might be correct in pure employment law terms, the impact that these allegations have on cricket are far wider than simply Yorkshire Cricket Club. It would come as a great surprise to me, given the contents of the report we've seen so far, if there are not disciplinary proceedings now launched against Yorkshire County Cricket Club, and potentially some of its players as staff, depending on the precise context of the report, because the ECB is duty bound to look into it now.
So as we look at this, are we talking about education, training, whatever? Are the people involved in this up to the task of managing a problem that we've seen unfold here with the Yorkshire Club? It
is mandatory that if an allegation of discrimination is found to have been proven, it is mandatory that there is not simply a suspension and a fine, but that particular individual is obliged to carry out an education course within a set period of time. And if they don't carry out that education course within a set period of time, their suspension is indefinite. Now, I've looked at recent ECB decisions, and there are recommendations for education. It is not mandatory. Well, every employer in this country, this jurisdiction, England and Wales, has to have an equality, diversity and inclusion policy. But what I have seen in sports, I'm not going to name names, but sometimes it can be a box-ticking exercise, that a policy exists, but it's not implemented in practice, and there's very limited training.
What are the lines that people have to face, the fine lines between banter and the obvious informality that exists within team members or I suppose any activity, certainly sport, and the transgression of that, because often that can be a very fine line or difficult to read?
Well, I agree with that, and I suspect many of us who've played sport in the past may have heard historically comments, but I'm afraid certainly within this jurisdiction, society evolves, culture evolves, and standards that may once upon a time have been overlooked, I'm afraid are no longer acceptable standards. But I will say this, Charu, and I think it's important, when it comes to harassment, the legal test, and this is going to sound slightly counterintuitive and complicated, is a mixed objective and subjective test. So you may feel offended by something that is stated, but the next step is whether a reasonable person would also feel the same way. And so there may be contexts, after a game, joshing, that nobody feels offended, nobody feels personally offended, and nobody from the outside could view it as being offensive. But you take those words totally out of the context, and it would look potentially like a harassment of some sort. So context is key, and it's something that's drummed into all disciplinary panelists and investigators, that you don't just take words and look at them in a dictionary sense. You look at the context in which they are used. And I think that's very important to remind listeners in terms of it isn't just a pure black and white answer.
John, thank you for your input. Really fascinating to get your experts' take and your insight. John Mehrzad QC at Littleton Chambers, specialising in sports law and commercial. Well, listening to all of that along with us is Anuj Dal, all-rounder with Derbyshire County Cricket Club and Vice-Chair of the Professional Cricketers Association. Anuj is also part of the PCA's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Group. Hi Anuj, I just wonder what your thoughts are on what you've been hearing there from John.
Hi Alison, firstly thank you for having me on the podcast. I think it's it's a massive topic at the moment, and it's heartbreaking actually to hear what Azeem had to go through. But on the other hand, it's a topic that fortunately the PCA and our governing body have been so proactive in trying to deal with, in terms of the education side of it. Just making players aware of actually that this topic is so ever so present in our game at the moment, and it's very important that it's being addressed properly.
And it was Jim Maxwell in Sydney, listening to your fine words there. But a couple of months ago, you mentioned in an interview with your club's website that it's now is the time, a great time, to challenge and have further education. Have you been or seen any of these new educational programs, and what do they involve?
Yes, hi Jim. It's the education side of it is really powerful. It's run by the EW group, and it's been delivered to 90 different groups across the playing membership. Not only players, staff members. It's run to academy members in the youth pathways as well. They're very informative. They create hopefully an environment where players within our changing room are comfortable just asking questions, understanding what is construed as banter, what is construed as actual racism. The uptake has been absolutely fantastic. Not only we had those education sessions with the EW group, but also we've had follow-up sessions. We've had videos from each player, from players across all the counties. Also the England Cricket Board, their men's teams and female teams. We've had videos from across the whole system talking about how they've engaged with the education sessions. Also hearing about what other players had to kind of deal with. I know before the education sessions were actually tied in, we had a kind of a pilot session that incorporated a lot of players from different counties. We had some England players on there. I know on the pilot group that I had Chris Jordan in there, and it was extremely powerful hearing your own teammates and also other fellow professionals talk about what they'd had to deal with, and it was really, really powerful. And you can see that what it has done is it has just made this stigma of racism. It's kind of eradicated that a little bit, and it's just made people more aware and comfortable to actually talk about it and ask questions about it, because we have different players coming from different countries, and for them in one country, the social acceptance might be very different to actually what it's like in the UK. And And we want to create an open environment for players to be able to feel comfortable. And the best thing I've found is players feeling comfortable to ask me questions about my culture, about my religion, and what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, and likewise the same way.
Anuj, this is Charu Sharma from Bangalore, India. If you put on your PCA hat, Anuj, and what support have you been able to offer Azeem through the association? And what more can the organization do to help more who might be willing to come forth to be a whistleblower, or as Michael Holding may have said, to share their story of the racism they felt in the game?
Hi, Charu. I think right from the start, when Azeem first came out with the story, I think the PCA were very proactive in making sure that they were involved in the case. I mean, the whole point of the Professional Cricket Association is to support players no matter what through any form of issue. The PCA, as such a massive organisation, they do a brilliant job in making sure that regardless of where you are in the game, whether you're a current player, an ex-player, it's not just a one education session and then it's done. There's an EDI group that's very, very proactive in terms of looking at certain issues that are obviously cropping up now, what to kind of target in the future. This group consists of PCA members, ECB members, current and former players. It's an excellent group to sit on, and it's excellent to see the delivery of these sessions and how it's targeting the players, how it's giving them support, and how it will continue to give players all support moving forward.
Anuj, keep up the good work. Thank you for coming on Stumped this morning, and let's hope that the game and society with it can move in the right direction. Anuj Dal, thank you for being with us on Stumped.
Thanks, guys.
Well, that's it for Stumped this week here on All India Radio. Next week, we will look back on the final of the Men's T20 World Cup. We'll know who the champions are. But for now, my thanks to Jim Maxwell and Charu Sharma, and of course to you for listening. You can follow us during the week on Twitter. We're at BBCWS Sport. Use the hashtag BBC Stumped. See you again next week. Bye-bye.
From the BBC World Service, in association with ABC and All India Radio, this is Stumped.